Okay, so it's a very, very special welcome to Anthony Defay, who's brought the Artists' Room's Warhol exhibition to Southampton. And where we are today is the John Hansard Gallery, which is in Southampton University's campus. And the exhibition here is it's centred on the photography and the film work. So it's a special welcome to you, Anthony. Artists' Rooms is your vision. I mean, how do you feel about what you see in the gallery? Has it actually met your expectations, what you're seeing here today?
Well, the first thing to say is that the exhibition looks really wonderful, really thrilling. We're I think the only Artists' Rooms part of it is the stitched photographs and the self-portrait Polaroids and the 4 portraits of Andy Warhol by Robert Maplefork. But the concept of rooms is there on those other things, the screen tests, etc., and the films, so that it's a very special journey from room to room, from one medium to the other. And it's very moving and it's very accurate and it's really wonderful.
You talk about it being a journey for the viewer. Is there any particular favourite way that you would have enjoying that journey? Would you start at the screen tests or
I think the screen test is a good way to start, because apart from anything else it immediately brings up in you those feelings which are going through the people on the screen. They're all pretty much famous people, from Duchamp to Dennis Hopper to Edie Sedgwick, etc., Susan Sontag, and yet you see this question of shyness, embarrassment, boredom, pride, loss of confidence, all those things which haunt us throughout the day. You see them in famous people. You see people going through that. And so you're immediately on the side of the artist. You immediately recognize that the artist had all these feelings which we are so close to all the time but don't necessarily speak about, and yet which are a real part of our lives. So that by the time you're in the room with the screen tests, you love Andy Warhol. To be able to do that with those celebrities is an extraordinary achievement, and it's fascinating for us to see nothing but everything.
It was Andy's homage to the portrait painter, wasn't it? But rather than the canvas, it was a clockwork film camera.
I think that thing about stars, do you remember that thing he said about people coming to the factory? Everybody says it's to come and see Andy Warhol. It isn't. Everybody came to the factory to see all the famous people that came to the factory. And Andy was always enormously attracted to stars.
Andy's often quoted as liking the aura of celebrity. I mean, was that a theme that was enduring throughout his work, or did it kind of happen later on?
So I think right from the beginning he was interested in that world, and he was interested in that thing about, success as a job in New York. That idea that he had come from Pittsburgh, had to make his way in New York, and had to be successful as a designer, as a graphic artist, as somebody who had exhibitions of his drawings, as somebody who made books, special, beautiful books, and who was a real artist in his own right.
And the love of New York was an enduring theme for him as well, because the stitched photographs that we're seeing on display, he did those quite towards the end of his actual working career, and that was everyday, almost banal photography of aspects of New York, but given a timeless and immortal quality by the way he treated those pictures.
It was a very interesting thing to do, to take his own photographs, to multiply them, and then to do this unthinkable thing of sewing them together. And yet when you see it, it seems inevitable and it seems great, and they don't look dated or just to do with that time. They remain some extraordinary thing in the history of photography and the history of art. Why could nobody else think about that? It needed Andy to invent it.
And a big part of the notion of the stitched photographs is the symmetry of a 3x3 square or a 4x5 or some repeating number.
Yes.
Reproducibility and sort of manufacturability were quite big themes for all of Andy's work, weren't they?
Yes. He liked the idea that art could become more and more mechanical, and less the hand of the artist, and more factory made, so to speak. I think also that question of the multiple image starts really early on. If you look at the drawings of the 50s, you see double images, and it was something that he obviously always wanted to do, to be able to make many images, and that of course is the extraordinary success of his invention, that he would have an exhibition, for example, just of portraits of Joseph Beuys in different sizes and different colours, sometimes with camouflage put on the top, and then he'd do a portfolio of prints that went with them, and there would be unique prints that went with that. So he does one work from a Polaroid, and from that comes a colossal body of work, hundreds of works.
You could almost think that Andy invented multimedia almost before the multimedia tools existed. I'm loving the anecdote about the photo booth being the precursor to Polaroid.
Yes.
And the fact that he's treating, for the screen test, he's treating the film camera as an automatic means of taking a portrait, but not just capturing the sitter in a moment frozen in time, but capturing 3 or 4 minutes of their active life.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and how different they are, and how much you learn in the silence and very, very, very limited movement in those screen tests about those people. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
And probably all the more so looking back now that some of them are no longer with us.
Yes. Yeah, it's very interesting to see Susan Sontag looking young, isn't it?
I was thinking it's art on artists. I mean, Susan obviously being the definitive textbook photographer from that era. When I was studying my degree in photography, we did a lot of reading about Susan Sontag and her work. On Photography was the definitive volume.
Sure.
And suddenly to see the woman who was, the doyenne of the photographic art, seeing her reproduced in a photograph.
Yes.
But in a moving picture, not a still photograph.
Sure. But I think a great, great portrait of her is the screen test, and the way that she sort of emerges in it. She's very quiet, and then she emerges as Susan Sontag.
Yeah, so we're actually redefining our notion of a portrait because of Andy's vision of using a clockwork cine camera and filming these people, not for the definitive 15 minutes that he talked of, but for 3.5, 4 minutes for one roll of film.
But my God, it seems like a long time, doesn't it? As you watch it and you feel that shyness and embarrassment and what shall I do?
You definitively see that it is a roll of film, because you see the leader running through the camera,
yes.
And you see the little perforated holes and spots across the picture when you reach the end of the roll. So
sure.
The portrait's defined not by the size of the canvas, but by the length of the roll of film that Kodak produced in those days.
Sure, yes.
Am I not right in saying that some of these are actually slowed down very slightly?
They were filmed, I believe, at a different frame rate.
Yes.
They were filmed at 16 frames per second, and they're being other way around. They were filmed at 24 frames per second, but they're being displayed at 16. So
Yes.
they are, a 3-minute roll of film is actually running for 4 minutes.
That's it, yeah.
So you get a slightly longer chance to savour those sort of natural incidental.
So that's why there's that very slight Douglas Gordon feel to them.
Yeah, had a huge influence on
Yes.
On Douglas Gordon,
Oh,
yes.
yes.
Yes,
If you blink or sneeze, the room is quite serene, isn't it? More moments to savour it. The other sort of definitive name in the world of art that I see on the screen, Tess, is Marcel Duchamp.
It's a surprise to see him, isn't it? And it's wonderful to think of him from the first half of the 20th century, in a sense, handing over to Andy the second half. It's a wonderful thing.
And I feel that huge connection personally with Marcel Duchamp's work, because again, going back to my degree in photography,
Yes.
I was very interested in the work of the Surrealist movement. And I started my journey, like everyone does, looking at René Magritte and Salvador Dali. But I saw, Marcel's work and the famous urinals and porcelain fittings,
Yes.
made specifically to hang in the art gallery. I was doing a major photographic project 20 years ago now during my degree studies,
Yes.
and the French chateau we stayed in had the most beautiful original toilet bowls and wash basins, and I found myself making a homage to Marcel Duchamp by photographing these things really, really carefully.
There are quite a lot of photographs by Andy Warhol of urinals and of bathrooms and of lavatories taken in hotels around the world. It was not a subject that he shied away from.
Warhol was hugely in awe of Duchamp. When
Yes.
he went to Los Angeles for the first time, in Pasadena, there was this big retrospective of Duchamp's work, and he spent a lot of time there and met Duchamp. And I think the poster for that exhibition was the one which had the wanted image of Duchamp on the front,
Oh yes.
which had a huge impact on Warhol, and then he later used that same thing for his most wanted men
Yes.
image that he had in the World's Fair in
Yes,
New York.
yes. Ah, that's where it came from.
Yeah.
Oh, how fascinating.
Looking back on Duchamp and the relationship between Andy and Duchamp, and equally the screen test, which do you think was the bigger honour? Was it a bigger honour for Andy to be able to make a film portrait of Marcel Duchamp, or was it the bigger honour for Duchamp to be Warhol in that way?
Well, I think that Duchamp still feels, does he not, 100 years later, like he feels like a godlike figure, doesn't he? In the way that he's able to sort of cut through art history, and everything he did was extraordinary and new and perfect and important. And so it feels very appropriate to see him there with Andy Warhol at that moment. And I'm sure it was thrilling for Andy. But I also, and you see it in the image of Duchamp, he was enjoying himself, wasn't he? And perhaps he felt in some way that he'd inspired Andy, and that it was wonderful to be participating in something that in some way he'd started himself.
Returning the favour, as it were, really.
Exactly, yes, exactly that.
I mean, the parallels that I see, Marcel Duchamp was making art out of what was then the everyday.
Yes.
That was very much a common thread of Andy's as well. The Brillo
Absolutely.
pans, the Campbell soup tins, and we look back at them now in amazement. But it was, I think you yourself used the word banal in those days.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And when you come to the paintings, the late black and white diptychs, all the imagery is banal, and the same is true of the dollar sign, for example. I think that when you think that those images, those paratrooper boots, those paintings to do with camouflage, those religious exhortations, that humble hamburger series, all that is actually long before the Twin Towers and Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan and all the things that are happening today in the Middle East. and yet those paintings feel in some way to do with this time and feel prophetic. I think that's the power of them, that they're made 25, 30 years ago, and yet they look at the banality of that. It's the acme of banality, that dollar sign painting, and yet, you know, Wall Street, hedge funds, the whole problem of you know, world currencies in turmoil. You know, will Portugal stand up? The euro? All those things that are happening now, you feel those things when you look at that amazing picture.
I think you wouldn't see a modern day artist glorifying the euro sign as such, would you? It doesn't have quite the same worldwide impact. The dollar is so prophetic in so many ways, isn't it? Because a big thing with Andy was that art wasn't just a creative expression, it was a commercial vehicle as well, wasn't it?
Yes. And then there was that I remember that quote about, you know, I was asking all my friends, what should I be painting? What should I be doing? And then some lady came up with the right question. She said, Andy, what do you love most? Then I got it, I should paint money. It's very nice, isn't it?
But not just money in the notion of kind of treasure, but it was the dollar symbol, you know, representing
That's right.
the dominance of North America within world culture for most of the last century.
Yes. Yes, and what the dollar means today. You know, how big and strong that dollar is. Or are they printing money? What does it mean? So it brings up all sorts of questions in us, doesn't it? At this moment.
So we've had a chat and a kind of mental walk around the Hansard exhibition. We've had a discussion about the screen tests and the importance of them. We've looked at the stitch photographs. And there's quite an intimate little room which has got images just of Andy.
They're self-portraits, they're Polaroid self-portraits. And when we had a gallery, there was a travelling show of these which came from New York, and it was proposed to us to take the show. And when we had the exhibition, it seemed to me that they were so important and that it would be a great opportunity, if it was possible, to buy the show and to keep it and have it in this country. And that's what we did, and so I'm thrilled to see them in Southampton now. And that there are all sorts of different portraits of Andy. Andy straight, Andy not so straight, Andy in drag, and Andy in very different moods. And you know, that's how the paintings came, through those Polaroid portraits. He'd like to take a lot of them and then look at them and choose them and then make paintings from that, paintings or prints.
Coming back to that small room that has the Polaroids and
Yes,
the large
yes.
black and white portraits, they're Maplefork's work, aren't they?
They're by Robert Maplefork, who was a good friend of Andy, and I dare say that Andy in many ways envied him, his lifestyle, because Maplefork had this very adventurous private life. And, you know, he was somebody who celebrated being gay in New York at that time and had a reputation as a great photographer and as somebody who had made photographs about that somewhat hidden world underneath, that gay hidden world. I think what you can say, and I think this is why we chose it in this way, is that those tiny images by Andy, those tiny self-portraits, are saying one thing, But the portraits by Robert Mapplethorpe, there are 4 of them in the room. First of all, they're iconic images. That is exactly the way that I remember Warhol. That's the way he looked, as opposed to the Warhol you see in the Polaroid self-portraits. I saw him precisely the way that Mapplethorpe saw him.
Because he talks about self-image quite a lot, doesn't he?
Yes. And you can see in those pictures also this tragic person. You know, this courageous but tragic person that Andy was.
Coming back again to the very notion of Andy's film work, what would you say to people, to members of the public, expecting to see some kind of mainstream cinema on the screen when they come to look at Andy's film work?
Well, I do think that any aspect of Andy's work that you look at, he was radical in everything that he did. And with film, you know, he did something that nobody's ever done before. When you think about those films from Sleep to Blowjob to all of them, that was a different concept. And he really put his life and soul into that. You know, he said, I'm no longer a painter, I'm a filmmaker, didn't he?
The end of the 60s said he was going to give up painting.
Yes. So it became his whole life for a while. And it was a very, very radical approach to film.
I think we're seeing, you know, a great artist exploring the medium of film and becoming a great filmmaker that way.
And I think that when he shot in '68, Valerie Solanas was slightly off her rocker lady who wanted him to make a film from the script that she'd written, as I understand it, and he didn't want to do that, or he'd put it off, or whatever it was, and that's when she went crazy and attacked him and shot him, and so nearly killed him. So it was interesting to see that coming from that world, from that film world. That nearly brought about his death. Didn't he say something like, what is it? Maybe you remember, Keith. I always had the feeling that something about I always have the feeling that I'm watching television rather than living life.
Oh.
And ever since I was shot, I now know that I am watching television all the time. Something like that. It certainly changed him.
Anthony Keith, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.